I'm John Batchelor. Larry Kudlow of Kudlow Reports at CNBC and Kudlow Radio on the weekend is my colleague and co-host, and we're joined on an event-filled and fact-filled day by Sudeep Reddy of the Wall Street Journal, financial reporter, because these two stories, and I point them out as parallel ships, the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and the continuing resolution, now get pushed to the side of the canal. It's a very crowded canal we're trying to get through here. And the third story coming up, and in a gloomy fashion, this may be the story that worries everyone, if I understand the reporting. This has to do with the debt ceiling, a negotiation that has been underway for some time, but is front and center mid-month October to mid-month November. Sudeep, a very good evening to you. A short version of the debt ceiling. Why is this the one that I hear repeatedly worries the markets, worries everyone watching carefully about the dance between the two parties? Good evening, Sudeep.
Good evening, John. The debt ceiling is such a concern because it had been raised for decades and decades with a lot of posturing, but no real threat that it wouldn't be raised. And the debt ceiling allows the federal government to continue accruing new debt. It's $16.7 trillion right now, and Congress needs to approve any further increases, and we're basically running on fumes at the moment by tapping other accounts, by borrowing money from within the government to keep borrowing up, and we get to that point where something has to give. Either you run out of money and you start slashing government, 20-30% of government in one fell swoop, or you raise the debt ceiling and you figure out what to do by raising it. The reason it's an issue is because President Obama, after his experience in 2011, where we came very close, is now saying he will not raise the debt ceiling. He will not deal with any conditions to raise the debt ceiling, and he wants it done cleanly without any fight. And Republicans are saying no way.
Yeah, well, he's not going to get his way, Sudeep, on that. He's going to have to negotiate. In fact, he's going to have to get involved in all these things if they ever expect to resolve them. What happens here, as I understand it, from talking to some people at the Brookings Institute, or whatever that thing is, the Center for Policy Analysis, if you don't raise the debt limit, you can pay off the interest on the debt. We'll never default on the interest on the debt. And you can pay off the major entitlements, and you can pay off military stuff. But roughly one-third of the budget will not be financed, And to me, I don't know what third that is. I have no idea how the Treasury Department or anybody else can prioritize it. But it would send all the wrong signals to the domestic and international financial markets. That's what it's going to do. If you can't pay off your obligations, it sounds a bit like Greece. Now, we're not Greece, but it could lead to downgrades. It's going to lead to a lot of mockery. I mean, the stakes here are very high, not because we'll default on the interest, Sudeep, but because of the rest of the budget problem where we won't have enough money to cover.
Exactly. You're exactly right, Larry. 32% of the budget of the spending each year could not be done without borrowing, without raising the debt limit. And so the government just would start defaulting on obligations. The U.S. Treasury Department, on behalf of the government, makes almost 100 million payments a month. That's all the people who are on Social Security, other benefit programs, government contractors, anyone who gets a check from the government, it comes through that. That's part of that 100 million. And the Treasury Department says it doesn't have the technical capacity to start picking and choosing who to pay among those. I think it's a fairly good assumption, as you've made, that the Treasury Department would, of course, make sure it pays bondholders, because you don't want a debt default in that sense. But defaulting on other obligations is still a default. When we default on our bills, it still hits your credit report. It can still do some damage. It wouldn't be catastrophic if you're not defaulting on debt, but it would be severely, severely damaging. And so that's obviously not something you get to, which is why, as a game of chicken, this is so ridiculous, because John Boehner, the House Speaker, is not going to be the House Speaker who allows the United States to default on its debt over this kind of a standoff. And so all of the leadership knows that they have to bring their people to a point where this gets resolved. But the fact that we're even in this standoff means you could get close to the point where either you have an accident, somebody fails in a vote, and then you have you actually do have some kind of a limited default on some government obligations, or you just get too close to the point, start a market panic, lead to another downgrade of U.S. debt, and cause some of the damage that you were trying to prevent in the first place.
Sudeep, you write that in 2011, where they resolved this after a fight, there was the downgrade, as you mentioned, and the Dow Jones dropped 16% over the next months. Is that a similar scenario to this one, or worse or better, Sudeep?
I actually think it could be worse at this point, because if you look at where we are in the economy, we actually had some feeling going into that summer, even though we had problems with Europe, there were some other concerns. Now there's a really strong feeling that the reason the market has been held up over the last few months, really the last year, is in large part due to Federal Reserve easing. And when you have that much anxiety in markets, to the point that a lot of big players, big hedge funds, have just stayed out of the market. They didn't even want to be a part of this. That creates the conditions when there's so much leverage in the market, there's so much anxiety in the market, that if you create the spark, whatever it is, it could be something overseas, it could be something domestic, then you can end up with a very big slide in the stock market, and that's the accident you end up with. The 16% drop in the summer and fall of 2011 wasn't just because of not raising the debt ceiling in a timely fashion. There were other things going on, and all you needed was to provide the spark that led investors to start fleeing.
Yeah, I mean, look, right. That's all very difficult to parse through. I mean, Europe was on the verge of collapse, and I think that was the biggest factor behind the stock market. And actually, ironically, while we were being downgraded, U.S. Treasury bond prices went up and rates went down. And the reason for that was that people were fleeing Europe and coming to a haven of safety here in the United States. But I'll tell you a very quick anecdote on this business about prioritizing. I had an interview with Eric Cantor, House Majority Leader, on our CNBC show, and he was talking about prioritizing. That was sort of the hot thing. And I used, I believe it was Jerome Powell, who was a former Treasury official who was working for Brookings at the time, and he showed what would happen, how far you'd lose or how far you default on obligations if you didn't raise the debt ceiling. And I had to literally read numbers to Cantor during this interview and tell him that his idea was completely wrong. I had to do that, and he and I had very bad personal relationships for several months took to heal. Now, the reason I raise that is this. There is spillover, Sudeep, as you know, from the ACA. There's going to be spillover into the debt debate. Right now, the Republicans have a plan, a sort of vague plan.
We've got 30 seconds, Larry. Go ahead.
Debate. And part of that plan is to delay Obamacare for 1 year. They've also got tax reform instructions and regulatory issues and all the rest of it. But part of that plan gets us right back to square one with the idea that you're going to delay all of Obamacare for a year. And they can't get that through the Senate, obviously, and that can muck up all these things. If it spills over into the debt ceiling, that's what worries me more than any single thing.
Sudeep, you say mid-October, that's when the grimness sets in?
That is when it sets in. As you approach mid-October and people see that we need to see progress by then.
Sudeep Reddy of the Wall Street Journal, Larry Kudlow of CNBC, I'm John Batchelor.